Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. Let's go and do my June wrap up. So I feel like I had a bit of a strange June. I started off with a couple of SPFBO reads, so although the stats will include their ratings, I'm not going to publicly announce those ratings until I've read all 6 in my allocation for phase 1. I also had a DNF, and I thought overall I wasn't going to get that many books done, but then it was my birthday and my wife's birthday at the end of the month, so I took a week off and managed to squeeze in an extra 2 unplanned books as well. So as usual, I'll go through the stats first of all and leave the chapters down below so you can skip this section if you want to go straight on to hear about the books. So I read 7 books in total, plus there was that DNF as well, which doesn't get included in the stats in any way. The total page count that I had for June was 3,069, taking me to a year-to-date total of 19,431. The average page count for June was a little bit down on my previous, so I had a couple of shorter books, leaving this one at 438 pages for the month and taking the average for the year down 20 or 25 pages to 535. The average rating was also lower than the previous couple of months, standing at 3.57 stars, giving me a year-to-date average at the moment of 4.09. Onto the series, I've now started 8 different series this year. I've now finished 2, because I do have a finished series to talk about in this wrap up. There are 5 series that I've read the first book of this year and decided not to continue with, so they're not included in those series start figures. I'm up to date with 16 different series, so I've read everything that's been published, but the series hasn't yet been completed. And my total series that are ongoing at the moment, including those 16, is now up to 33. And then as usual, the last little stat at the bottom is an unhappy one this month, because the number of days since my last 5-star read is now sitting at 45. That was Pale Kings, I believe, by Bengali, that have finished in May. Alright, so into the talk of the books, and first of all, as usual, the DNF. So this one was A Realm of Stones and Whispers by Ginevra Mancinelli, book 1 of A Hello of Talons and Tears, I think it is. This is one that was pulled out of my TBR jar. It was on my self-pub list that I wanted to read this year. I've read a prequel, it's not quite a novella, a short novel I would say, to this series, and had mixed feelings about it, but I still wanted to give this first book in the series a try. I did feel a bit let down with this one in a couple of different ways. First of all, I didn't think the writing was as good as in the prequel, The Empress of Beasts and Myths. I think the writing style has evolved a little bit, with this one being written first, if I'm not mistaken, and that was quite visible to me. I didn't get on with it quite as much as I wanted to reading A Realm of Stones and Whispers. There were a few other bits in it that I didn't really like though. So first of all, as far as the story goes, I won't go into it too much, especially because I didn't finish it. So I DNF'd at 27%. The opening, it was largely dealing with noble families. Everybody who was a main character seemed to be a noble pretty much. And you've got a family for whom the eldest son, the heir to the lordship, I guess, has had an accident, and they're looking at contingency plans because they don't think that he's going to be able to pull through. And if he does, he's not going to be fit to take on the lordship. So they're trying to figure out which of the sons and daughters has got what it takes to become the heir. And then you've got a second storyline, which is a couple of officers of the law who stumble across a murder, essentially, and they're trying to track down the murderer and seek justice. And we see this story through the eyes of the murderer himself, rather than the officers being point of view characters. So that one was a little bit different. And I did like that storyline in kind of principle, I guess. I thought that was definitely more interesting. But the heir to the lordship storyline didn't really seem to go anywhere for me. It wasn't really holding my interest that much. There was one particular part of that storyline though that I didn't like, and it's kind of along the same lines as the main reason for me DNFing it, which was actually in the other storyline, so there is a bit of a crossover there. But in this one, the nobleman whose eyes you see this story from, the murderer essentially, he commits rape a couple of times, and while he's raping women, he takes out a knife and starts stabbing them, one to death and one he kills afterwards by accident. And so the book wasn't really working for me. Not only was that not a very pleasant storyline to be reading, but also there was no real reason given for it. I don't know whether this is something that comes up later on in the book that I obviously won't get to because I DNF'd it, but it just seemed to be for no reason other than because he could. There was no depth to the character. The only thing you really knew about him was he was a really unpleasant person because of these couple of acts that you saw through his eyes. So yeah, it wasn't the best of reading experiences for me, and I eventually gave up at around about a quarter of the way through the book. So then we have my first two reads for SPFBO 9, and as I say, I won't be including a star rating in this video. I will do an SPFBO wrap up essentially where I'll go through all 6 books in my allocation, and the plan is to give the star ratings at that time, and I'll certainly update our records on Goodreads and Storylace at that time to give those star ratings. But the first book that I read for SPFBO 9 was Daughter of the Beast by E.C. Greaves. This is book 1 of the Vaishivka trilogy. And I love this cover, first of all. It really spoke to me, it really drew me in, and that's why I wanted it in my allocation and was happy when I got my wish. But I had a really good time reading this as well. It was a really cool story focusing on a young girl who's taken captive by these beast women essentially. They raid her village, take her as a prisoner and basically raise her as one of their own. She, over time, because this story is told over the course of several years, she comes to, I guess, accept her place within this new society. She becomes family essentially. She classes her fellow raiders as her sisters, so there's a certain kinship that's developed over the course of this story. I like how all of that happens. I like how there's subtle little time jumps to get you through that relatively quickly, but I like the story that's with it as well. I won't talk too much about my overall thoughts of it because I do have a dedicated video review for this one, which you can find linked in the top corner there, but I definitely recommend this one. It's in the running to be my semi-finalist for SPFBO 9 because I had a really good time with it. And then I'll move straight on to my second SPFBO book, although I did read something in between these two. This one was Seekers: The Winds of Change by Troy Knowlton, and this is another one that I had a good time with. Again, there's a dedicated video review that I've done for this one, which I'll link in the top corner. Do go and check it out to find more about this book, why I liked it, and some of the finer details of it. I liked in here that you had a couple of different storylines that did intersect at various points. You had two best friends, essentially, one in each storyline. So instead of it being kind of a buddy movie in book form, they were separate and you got to see them build their own relationships rather than just carrying on a pre-existing one. I liked that. I liked the characters they got involved with. I liked the storyline. There was definitely a bit of kind of Indiana Jones about it in various places, seeking powerful artifacts and trying to stop essentially forces of evil from getting their hands on them. And overall, I think it worked very well. There were a couple of bits, as with any book, that I didn't get on with quite so much in here, but overall it was a really good read. I very much enjoyed it. It's another one that I'm looking forward to continuing when the next book is available, and it's another one that's in with a shot at being my SPFBO semi-finalist. Okay, so in between those two SPFBO reads, I did listen to an audiobook. This was Dead Stars Part 1 by Bengali, book 3 of Emaneska. I've been really enjoying Emaneska so far, and sadly for me, that experience did take a bit of a hit with this one because I really didn't have a great time with it. The story from The Written and Pale Kings I thought was really well told. It really developed quite nicely and I was on board with the characters and where they were and what they were doing. And then that all kind of changed in Dead Stars Part 1. There was a bit of a time jump and I was trying to piece together what had happened to lead our main character Farden to where I found him at the start of the book. It really kind of threw me, and I also just didn't like where we landed with it. Basically, the storyline that we had here was, I guess it was at such a disconnect from the previous books that I'd enjoyed so much that maybe that played into it as well. I didn't enjoy it that much in general, but maybe I felt worse about it because it was such a letdown from the previous books. So we did kind of move back to where I was expecting to be toward the end of the book, so at least I do have that to hold on to as kind of hope for book 4, the final book in the series, which I am just about to start up. But overall, yeah, this one really didn't do well for me. I was very disappointed with it, and I think I gave both book 1 and book 2 5 stars, but for Dead Stars, quite aptly, it didn't do so well, and I ended up giving this one just 3 stars. The audiobook I moved on to next was to continue my buddy read of The Expanse with my book bestie Nina. We were up to book 6, Babylon's Ashes, and there's not too much to say about this one, I guess, I had a really good time with it. I've been enjoying the series as a whole. There have been a couple of standouts from both Nina and myself who said that Nemesis Games Book 5 has been our favourite so far, so this one wasn't as good as that. But I still really did enjoy it. I enjoyed it more than Nina did, and a few other friends who I know who've read it also didn't seem to have quite the same experience I did. I think I'm just enjoying the series as a whole, so my general perception, as I've said many a time in my videos, I generally tend to enjoy books in a series the deeper they get into the series, as we know more about the world, the characters and so forth. That definitely helps out here, even though it didn't with Dead Stars Part 1. But with Babylon's Ashes, I think one of the things that people maybe don't like it so much for is that it doesn't have a really big kind of major storyline to itself. It's more of a, I've heard some people call it a filler book, I would say certainly a transition book. It's more to kind of wrap up the story arc of the books before and give a starting point basically for the next storyline. So I'm really excited to see what that storyline is and where it takes us. But as far as Babylon's Ashes go, I still really enjoyed it. The narration's great. I'm loving the characters. I'm loving their interactions. Still loving my favourites, Amos and Avasarala. So looking forward to more and more of those in the last 3 books, which I've got lined up over the next couple of months. But for Babylon's Ashes, I ended up giving 4 stars. Then I moved on to another book that was on my 2023 reading plan. This one was for series that I wanted to start. I can't remember, I think this one might have been a pick from my TBR jar, or maybe my patrons chose it for me. I'm not sure, but that doesn't really matter at this point. The book that I read was Blood of an Exile by Brian Naslund. This is book 1 of his Dragons of Terror series. It's one that I'd previously read the opening chapter for, or I don't think I read the whole chapter, it was quite long. I think I read sort of half or 2/3 of the opening chapter until there was a good break-off point. But I did that for one of my first chapter reads videos. I quite enjoyed it. It had a good bit of world building. It was a bit strange. There was a good hook or two in there. There was some unknowns that you wanted to find out more about. And of course we did find out more about them through here. There was one random bit with red snails, I think it was, that they were, the characters at the start of the story were doing some investigation on. And that just kind of fell away in this book, and then right at the end it was mentioned again, so that was really weird. But overall it was an okay book. It was enjoyable enough, but it was also, I don't know, kind of a bit of a letdown in its own way as well, because I was quite enjoying it and it was trundling along quite nicely, and then somewhere between sort of halfway and 2/3 of the way through it kind of lost its way. The story had a bit of a change, and I really felt that not too much was happening. There were also some bits, especially in that last portion of the book, that I didn't really like. We've got a character who is all but indestructible, and I dislike that in a book, especially when we're talking about our main character, because there's no sense of intensity, there's no sense of will he be okay, will he get out of this battle, will he get out of this situation, is he going to stay alive, be living at the end of the book. If he's kind of indestructible and you can do pretty much what you want and he'll just bounce back from it, it takes all of that away and it makes it kind of boring for me, if I'm honest. So I did say to, I think it was in my weekly Patreon video where I do a reading update, I did say it seemed like they could chop off his head and he'd just get up and grow a new one and he'd be alright after a day or two. So I don't know, it just wasn't quite the book for me. I decided that I'm not going to continue with this series. It was an okay opening book, but I don't feel like there was anything in there that really made me want to read the next book. I think it was for this one that someone told me the next book is from a different point of view, or it incorporates a different point of view, but that doesn't sell it to me. I didn't see enough in here basically to make me want to continue, so I'm going to leave this one as is. I'm glad that I read it, but it's the only one in the series that I will read. I ended up giving this one 3 stars. So then, as I said at the start of the video, I got to the end of the month and having a week off that I'd given myself, being self-employed does have its benefits definitely. I got myself another couple of books to read, so I dipped into my TBR jar and I pulled out first of all an audiobook of a series that I hadn't touched in quite a while, and I don't really talk about too much. It's not really on the radar of most, I think, of my viewers, but I don't know, maybe people have heard of it. But this one was Madame Guillotine. It's book 3 in a series called Tyrus Rex, Contracts and Terminations, and it's by Jason Anspach and Nick Cole. Now, these two are sci-fi authors. They write military sci-fi, and there's a series that I got into when I had a fantasy reading slump called Galaxy's Edge, and I binged through that series basically. And one of the characters who you're introduced to in that series is the bounty hunter Tyrus Rex, who's a bit of a legend in this world. And this is kind of a spin-off series, I guess, featuring him as a younger character, and it's just a series of standalone stories chronicling some of the missions that he went on and how he became the legend that we are introduced to essentially within the Galaxy's Edge series. As far as the storyline in this one goes, it's kind of a hostage rescue situation. There's a planet where there's revolution going down and there's all sorts happening. There are various factions who are trying to take out the Legionnaires, who are the kind of peacekeepers of the world essentially. And you've got a planned attack on some Legionnaires who are trying to keep the peace. They take a couple of these Legionnaires captive and they're executing them kind of on TV essentially, or the equivalent of, and Tyrus Rex, this legendary bounty hunter, goes in to try and rescue them and dissolve the situation essentially. So if you've read the series, and if you read this book, you really should have read the series. You know exactly what to expect from the story, and it doesn't disappoint in that. It's quite formulaic. It's not one that breaks any boundaries or anything along those lines, but it was quite enjoyable for me as someone who's read a number of books. I think this was my 12th, 13th, I don't know, within this series by these authors. So yeah, I had a good time with it. It was nice to get back to the world, and it was also nice to finish this one off and get a tick in my completed series box. I gave this one 3.5 stars. It wasn't, as I say, anything special, but it was a nice solid story, and one of those books that I think for me was pretty much a comfort read really. And then the last book I picked up for the month was another one out of my TBR jar, and happily for me, another one off my reading plan. This is one of the self-pub books that I have for 2023, and it was book 2 of Pillars of Peace by Tom Dumbrell, No Place for Peace. So this one's quite short, it's quite a nice read. The first book, The Look of the King, really set the scene for this one. It's a very much a low fantasy, it's secondary world, but there's no real magic or anything along those lines. It's more about the characters and the story, and that continued with this one. So you deal mostly with Cyrus in here, one of the two characters from The Look of the King. He's going off to a neighbouring kingdom as essentially as a hostage. I was explaining it to my wife, and I said if he was a lot younger, they would call him the ward of the king. He's gone to essentially live in this other kingdom as security, if you like, to ensure peace between the two kingdoms. That's quite a contentious arrangement for Cyrus because he doesn't get on with the king because of the events of the first book essentially, but it's quite nice to see the development and the way that he's open to seeing how different people can be when you spend time with them. Obviously that's not all that happens though. He ends up going out exploring the world a little bit because he's sent on a mission by King Simeon, and he's got to find Simeon's essentially estranged son because the king is in ill health, and he wants to see his son before he dies and to make amends for the split in their relationship. So obviously I won't go into the overall story, but it's quite an enjoyable one. I thought it was ticking along quite nicely up to maybe halfway, maybe a bit beyond halfway, and then everything really ramped up and I raced to the end and I really had a good time with it. So it wasn't quite the story of two halves, but there was quite a bit of setup at the start of the book, enjoyable setup though, nicely done through storytelling. And then yeah, the back half was just an absolute banger. So really happy that I got to this one. I've got one more book left in the series. Not sure when I'm going to get to it, but hopefully it won't be too long. This one I gave 4 stars to, and definitely recommend. So that's how my June went anyway. It was a bit up and down. The stats maybe don't look quite so good, but I still think I had a really good month, and it's one that I'm really happy about. Let me know in the comments down below how your month went, and if you've read any of these books, what did you think of them? I'll hopefully see you in the next video sometime soon, but until then, as always, take care of yourselves, read some good books. Bye for now.